All right. Western philosophy begins with Socrates. And when I think of Socrates, the overwhelming characteristic that always comes to my mind is that he was a very vexing person. He was very unsettling. He was an irksome person. Why? Why was he unsettling? Why was he vexing? What he would do is he would walk around well, they weren't streets, he'd walk around the town square of Athens, and he'd approach people and ask them how they were living and whether or not they could justify the way they were living. And he would ask these people the question on a day-to-day basis. And invariably, the person he approached would start out very confidently, explaining how he was living and why he was living that way. But then Socrates would ask a question, and then Socrates asked another question, and before too long, his interlocutors would come to see that they really couldn't justify the way they were living, that their general framework of the ethical life didn't fit together. There were incoherences in it. And this was not a pleasant experience for his interlocutors. Many people that spoke with Socrates described the conversation with him as being one that induced vertigo. Enough people say it that it seems like it actually happened, where they would start to get dizzy. They thought they knew what they were talking about, and then things that they thought were in place started to move around, and they literally had the physical sensation sometimes of nausea. So that's the impression that Socrates made on people, and it did not make him popular. In fact, it got him killed. I had a similar experience to talking to Socrates when I was a sophomore in college. When I was a sophomore in college, I read an article by Peter Singer that did to me what I expect it was Socrates did to a lot of people. And the article was called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. It was first published in 1972 when Peter Singer was 25 years old. It was published in a philosophy journal in 72. Since then, it's been reprinted dozens, I actually think probably hundreds of times. And the most recent edition is in the form of a little book published by Oxford University Press, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, with a foreword by Bill and Melinda Gates. And that just came out this month. And that has his article plus a couple of other things. But basically, it's the article with Bill and Melinda Gates introducing it. So what's this article about? Why did it induce vertigo in me? When Singer was writing the article, he was impressed by the existence of two kinds of phenomena. First of all, he was writing, and there was a great deal of famine going on, particularly in East Bengal, which became Bangladesh. But it goes on all the time, and he was aware of that. Children were dying of starvation. Children were dying of easy-to-treat diseases, and he was seeing it on the news. At the same time, in Australia where he lived, or the UK, or the United States, there were many people engaged in a consumer lifestyle, spending money on all sorts of things that didn't seem like essential items. And the question he was asking was, is this a justifiable state of affairs? Can we endorse the fact that we're living like this while this is happening? Now, when I teach this to my undergraduates, I usually start out by talking about the ways the super rich spend their money. And so I think that's Steve Jobs' yacht. Yachts that cost tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, private airplanes, and we have a lot of fun talking about the ways the super rich spend their money. Peter Singer himself in recent work has talked about how there's currently a vogue for buying $50,000 watches when a watch for $40 or $50 keeps just as good time, while children are dying of starvation and easy to prevent diseases. So we talk about that in my class, but as Peter Singer does, it's easy enough to point out that it's not simply the super rich who are spending money on these sorts of things. When we spend money on clothes that we don't need to keep warm, we don't need really for any particular reason other than that we like them, they look nice. We're spending money on a luxury item. We're spending money on something that we clearly don't need. When we go out to dinner, whether we're spending $10, $20, $30, $40, and we know we could feed ourselves at home for $1 or $2, once again, we're spending money on things that we clearly don't need for our well-being. And when I'm giving this talk to my undergraduates, typically it's a big lecture hall, and it's easy to point to some people who have their Starbucks, especially if it's a 9 or 10 o'clock class, a $4, $5, $6 drink. I do it too, every day. But I can point to people who have these drinks, and I say, how much does that cost? How many of those drinks do you buy in a year? Do you really need it? Well, of course not. If you absolutely need the caffeine, you could get caffeine in a much more inexpensive way, but you're still spending the money. So Peter Singer's question is, this is happening. People are spending money on these sorts of things while that's happening. Now, of course, we could put lots of harrowing images of people starving, and I'm not going to inflict that on you. Let's just look at one statistic. We could put many more. 30,000 children die every day from diarrhea, measles, malaria, and other avoidable poverty-related causes. So we look at these two states of affairs, these two sets of phenomena, and we ask with Singer, is this justifiable? Can we endorse this? Can we say this is okay? And Singer's argument in his article is that it's not okay. This is unjustifiable. This isn't something that we can embrace. And he does this by making two sorts of arguments. The first sort of argument is based on images. We'll look at that now. The second sort of argument has more philosophical premises without the images. We'll start out with the story kind of argument. And this is perhaps the most famous part of the argument. If you've heard of this stuff, this might be the one thing you've heard of. I'll call it the shallow pond argument. And it's a thought experiment. Imagine somebody is walking by a shallow pond. It's a few feet deep, and there's nobody else around. And there's a toddler in the shallow pond, and we don't know how the toddler got there, and the toddler is drowning. And if this person doesn't do anything, the toddler will drown. The person can just walk into the pond and save the child's life. It would be easy for him to do that. But he's got on a new pair of $200 Italian shoes, and he will ruin his shoes. And he doesn't have time to take them off. So he will ruin his shoes. Let's imagine that this person says, well, I'm really sorry that that child has died. But gosh, you know, my shoes were brand new and they cost me $200. What would be our moral evaluation of that person? We'd think he's a moral monster. We'd think he'd done something wrong. It wasn't just that he failed to show charity above and beyond the call of duty. It seems like he actually failed to do his duty. He did something wrong. Okay, that's the first part. The second part is to imagine another case. Call this the envelope case. A person comes home from work, and she's got all of her envelopes, and she's going through them. And one of the envelopes is from UNICEF or Oxfam, and it says, if you send $200 right now, you can help to save the life of a child that's dying from some easy-to-prevent disease. And there's an envelope there that's pre-stamped. All she needs to do is write the check, put it in the envelope, and put it back in the mailbox. And she can send away the money that will help save the life of a child. But she's thinking of buying some $200 shoes tomorrow. And so she throws the envelope away. Maybe she doesn't even give it a second thought because these things come all the time. Okay. Singer's argument goes like this. The conduct in the shallow pond case is morally very wrong. Now, some people could deny that, and sometimes I do hear people deny that, but most people are on board with that idea, that this person did something morally egregious. But, second claim, the conduct in the envelope case is as morally wrong as the conduct in the shallow pond case. Because in both cases, a person has valued the $200 more than the life of a child. In both cases, it would have been very easy to save the life of the child, but the person valued the $200 more. Therefore, this very simple argument concludes, the conduct in the envelope case is morally very wrong. When a person fails to send the money in that situation, it's not just that she isn't being as charitable as maybe it would be nice to her to be. According to this argument, she's doing something that's morally as dubious as the guy who walked by the drowning child. Okay, that's the famous argument. There has been something of a cottage industry in giving different stories, different ways of getting at the same point. I'm just going to talk about one because Singer has come to think this other story actually captures better the situation. And then we could actually spend hours and hours going over these different stories. But this other story, we can call it the Bugatti and the retirement fund, and it's due to a philosopher named Peter Unger. In this story, there's a guy named Bob. And Bob has $200,000 for retirement. And what he decides to do is invest it in an antique Bugatti automobile. because he's come to think, and let's say he's right about this, it's the best investment. It's the best way he can be sure that he'll have a good rate of return. And he doesn't drive it except once a month. The rest of the time he keeps it away. But once a month he takes it out into the countryside for a picnic. And he takes it out on one Sunday, and lo and behold, he sees that a poor toddler has wandered onto the train tracks. And the toddler has fallen down and can't get up, and there's a train coming, and the toddler is going to be killed by the train. And the only way that Bob can save the toddler is by pushing his Bugatti onto the tracks. And the train will destroy the Bugatti, and he'll lose his $200,000, but the child will be saved. Okay. Well, according to Unger and Singer, most people have the intuition. By letting a train destroy his $200,000 Bugatti, Bob can save the life of a child. Bob morally ought to let the train destroy the Bugatti to save the life of the child. It's a real shame for him, but a child's life is worth $200,000. It seems like that's what he ought to do. Second case, you can probably see where this is going. Rob has a retirement account with $200,000 in it. He gets the same envelope that our previous person got. But this envelope says if you send $2,000, you can save the life of a child. But Bob, in order to send that $2,000, would have to take $2,000 out of his retirement account. Well, if Rob withdraws $2,000 from his $200,000 retirement fund, he could save the life of a child. Well, if Bob morally ought to let the train destroy his Bugatti, then certainly Rob morally ought to withdraw the $2,000, because that's only $2,000 versus all of it. So it looks like Rob has an obligation to withdraw the $2,000, that if he doesn't, he's doing something wrong. Now, this is just another permutation on the shallow pond example. Singer's come to think this captures, the $2,000 captures better what it actually costs, but it's just a colorful example. So that's the first kind of argument that he gives, these arguments based on images and stories. He also gives a second argument, which he calls the basic argument, which doesn't use the stories so much, it uses straight ahead premises, philosophical claims. The basic argument starts with this claim. Suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. Now, what Singer says is, you know, I'm not really going to argue for this claim, and some people might deny it. Some people might have reasons to think that these things are actually goods in some way. But gosh, don't most of us think these are bad things? It's better if these things don't happen than if they happen. This seems like a pretty uncontroversial premise, even if we can't quite give an argument for it, because gosh, it sort of seems like it sits at the ground floor of our moral thought. And it doesn't seem like there's something underneath it. It seems like this is a basic idea we have. Okay, so that's the first premise. The second premise, he thinks, is almost as uncontroversial as the first premise. If it's in our power to prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything as important, it is wrong not to do so. So if you can prevent something very bad from happening, and you don't have to sacrifice anything that you think is as important, so this could all work totally within your own mind. We don't need to bring in some external standard of what's important, just based on our own thinking about what's important and what isn't. If we think something isn't as important as this very bad thing that's happening, we think, well, we ought to sacrifice that. Third premise, this is an empirical claim. By donating thousands of dollars to aid agencies, many Americans can prevent suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care without sacrificing anything as important. This is based on the empirical claim that a lot of Americans spend money on things that they themselves don't believe are as important as the life of a child. And at the same time, that it's true that we could send that money to an aid agency that would save the life of a child. So if we're spending money on things that we don't think are as important as the life of a child, and we think we could send it to an aid agency that would save the life of the child, then 3 seems to stand. But you can see where this leads. If many Americans do not donate thousands of dollars to aid agencies, they are doing something wrong. Now, it leads in the same place as the shallow pond and the Bugatti example, but this doesn't use the stories, this uses premises that Singer thinks are very hard to deny. Okay? The thing that blows me away about this article every time I read it, and I've read it dozens of times, is that these are very short and simple arguments. They are not complicated. I can show you complicated philosophical arguments. These aren't complicated. They're pretty easy to see, but they lead to very strong conclusions. Now, you could also say that what's underlying these arguments is a basic belief that we have in the moral equality of all human lives, or at least of all lives of children. I mean, you might, and some people do make arguments that maybe adults have what's coming to them because they have responsibilities, blah, blah. You could make an argument like that. But if we stick with children, it's easy to say a child's life matters just as much, whether it's in the shallow pond on the U of A campus or it's in a desert on the other side of the world. The fact that a child happens to be a couple feet away or 30,000 miles away doesn't mean anything with regard to the moral value of that life. And this arguably is an incredibly fundamental moral belief of ours, that human lives are morally equal. But if so, then it looks like the shallow pond argument and the basic argument are going to get a grip very easily. So what's the outcome? Well, as I said, seems to me that they're pretty simple arguments based on a pretty fundamental moral belief that virtually everyone holds. But the outcome is incredibly controversial, incredibly provocative. Here's my paraphrase of one paragraph in his text, and then we'll look explicitly at what he says. It says, the outcome of this argument is that our traditional moral categories cannot be justified. We would not be sacrificing anything significant, even by our own lights, if we were to forego new clothes, dinners out, vacations, etc., and give the money to famine relief instead. By doing so, we would be preventing another person from starving. To give money away rather than spend it on such things is not charitable or generous. On the contrary, and this is a quote, we ought to give the money away and it is wrong not to do so. This, like with Socrates, does not make him popular. People do not like to be told that the way they're living is incredibly indefensible, which is what Socrates got people to see. That's what this article does. You might wonder why Bill and Melinda Gates wrote the foreword. But these are two more quotes from the conclusion of his piece. Given the present conditions in many parts of the world, it follows from my argument that we ought morally to be working full time to relieve great suffering of the sort that occurs as a result of famine or other disasters. It follows that I and everyone else in similar circumstances ought to give as much as possible. That is, at least up to the point at which by giving more, one would begin to cause serious suffering from oneself and one's dependents, perhaps even beyond this point to the point of marginal utility, at which by giving more, one would cause oneself and one's dependents as much suffering as one would prevent in Bengal, because at the time he was writing, the worst famine was in East Bengal. The moral equality of all humans' lives seems to lead in this direction. If someone else is suffering, we should help that person until we're at the same point as that person. That's the argument. Now, the argument has had a huge impact on lots of people, for good and ill. A book that came out last year, which maybe some of you have heard about, is called Strangers Drowning. It's based on Larissa McFarquhar wrote these articles for The New Yorker, and then they're collected in the book with a lot of other connecting tissue based on a lot of philosophy. So the book is called Strangers Drowning, Grappling with Impossible Idealism, Drastic Choices, and the Overpowering Urge to Help. And what this book is a series of profiles of people who have taken this message to heart and have decided they really should reduce themselves to marginal utility. And they live on a pittance a year and spend all their time helping others. It's as though they're living by an ocean or a lake, and people are drowning every day. And they see the people drowning. And they can't just keep walking by and go to work and go to the movies and meet their friends for dinner when their people are drowning. And so they're compelled to go in and save the people, except they're not literally drowning, but they're dying in ways that they see are preventable as the drowning people. And of course, the strangers drowning is an allusion to the shallow pond argument, a direct reference to that. So in that book, you get stories of people who read Singer and had this response. Not all of them read Singer, but a lot of them did. There's another movement that started about 10 years ago and that is originates directly with the reading of this article by Peter Singer, and it's gotten quite big. It's called the effective altruism movement. And you can read about this in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Washington Post, lots of newspapers and magazines have had articles about this movement. And this is the web page, the front web page from the movement. It says, if you are reading this, you are in an extraordinary position. It has never been more possible for you to have a meaningful positive impact on a massive scale. With the rise of evidence-driven interventions, we each have an unprecedented opportunity to save lives and prevent unnecessary suffering. Effective, now I just blew up what's here. Effective altruism is a growing social movement that combines both the heart and the head. Compassion guided by data and reason. The idea is compassion is what we think is the heart of morality, helping people. And what we need to do is use reason and evidence-based studies about how best to help people. And that's what the effective altruism movement claims it's doing. It's taking the basic value of compassion and being as rational as possible about how to implement that in our lives. And here they talk about the effective altruist values, open-mindedness, consider all causes and actions, and then act in the way that brings about the greatest positive impact. Critical thinking, apply evidence and reason to determine the most effective ways to improve the world. And global empathy, the idea that we should be concerned with everyone, value all sentient life, regardless of nationality, creed, ancestry, religion, or species. The species part gets us into another talk about Singer, which I won't do now. So how do you live the effective altruist life? Well, the Washington Post had a profile of one person who was influenced by Singer's ideas to implement the effective altruist ideas. He's just one example, but what he does is quite similar to what they propose everyone who can do it should do it. And this guy's name is Jason Trigg. He went to MIT, I believe. He studied computer science and math. He was very good with quantitative things. And he was influenced by Singer's ideas and decided, what can I do to create the most good in the world? And what he decided is, I can create the most good in the world by joining a hedge fund. Why? Well, by joining a hedge fund, he was going to get $100,000 in salary. He thought, there's no reason I can't live on $50,000. I mean, that is not hard, especially because I've been a student. $50,000, it's much, much, much more than most humans have ever lived on. Certainly I can do that. And he calculated, and this is based on evidence, it's not drawn out of the blue, it costs about $2,500 to save a life if it's used in the right way. So this year, he could save 20 lives. Furthermore, he calculated that his average salary over the course of his career would be $500,000. I guess it was a very successful hedge fund. But apparently this is not at least at the time, it wasn't an unrealistic idea. And he saw no reason that he couldn't continue to live on $50,000. It's still a lot of money for one person to live on, especially when you compare it to all these others. He thought he could do this for 20 years before he totally burned out. So he would end up giving $9 million, and it cost $2,500 to save a life. So he thought, this is the way I can do the most good. I can save 3,600 lives if I do this. And this is the kind of reasoning that effective altruism promotes. It says we should try to maximize the good. Now, not all of us could be as quantitatively adept as him. Maybe we couldn't all get these jobs, but we should be trying to figure out how we can save the most lives. So I asked my undergraduates about this. I say, let's say you're finishing up college and you're trying to decide what kind of life you want to live. How should you make a decision? Well, here's a motto that you see a lot. It says, do what you love what you do. And so it's like, that's really what you should. You should do what you love what you do. If you want to be an interior designer, go ahead and do that. If you want to open a really cool coffee shop, if you want to study ancient Greek philosophy, go, if that's what you love, follow your bliss. Okay? But then you say, well, there's another option. Maybe you shouldn't be so self-centered. Maybe you should join the Peace Corps, or you should go to work at some inner city school. Take some profession where you actually help people instead of just reading Plato and Aristotle or making coffee. You could do that. And geez, isn't that better than this? But then the effective altruist says, yeah, but you could also take a job where you can make the most money possible and live relatively frugally. And what's most ethical? Well, according to the effective altruists, that's the most ethical. I mean, here you might save the life or greatly benefit, I don't know, a few people, dozens of people. Here, who knows, you'll help yourself, but who knows how many other people you'll actually help, how much good you'll actually do. But there, you can really make a difference. And according to the effective altruists, this is where Singer's argument leads. This is what we're obligated to do. This is compassion with reason. This is not a settling conclusion for many people. For Jason Trigg it was. For the people in Strangers Drowning that are profiled, this they took on board. But many people do not think this conclusion follows, but it's hard to see exactly what the justifiable grounds are for rejecting the conclusion. So in the remaining time, and I do hope we have time for questions, I want to talk about some ways we might try to push back, but we'll have to ask whether they work. One is you can say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go work for a hedge fund. That seems boring. I want to do something more in line. Well, that isn't really a sufficient answer. Merely not wanting to do it, we need something more than that, at least if we're in a philosophy class. Another idea is that, it doesn't really work. And this is a book that was written, I think, 15, 20 years ago, The Road to Hell, The Ravaging Effects of Foreign Aid and International Charity, which purports to be, and for all I know was, empirically grounded exploration of how much damage aid agencies actually do. It doesn't work. I don't know that that's still a tenable objection to this for exactly the reasons that the effective altruists point to. The effective altruist, the effective part, means it's supposed to be very evidence-based. And Bill and Melinda Gates and Warren Buffett have both given tens of billions of dollars to the kinds of agencies that we could give to. And I don't think they're in the business of giving tens of billions of dollars without doing their research. It might have been when Singer was writing in the 70s that we didn't have good ways of figuring out what aid works and what aid doesn't, but we've gotten a lot better. Now, you could still argue it. I mean, this is an empirically and devilishly complex question, and I'm not really qualified to say for sure that these organizations work, but Bill Gates will tell you giving to malaria, giving to organizations that give out malaria nets saves lives. So anyway, that's how the it won't work objection would be at least met. Here's another objection. It's counterintuitive. It conflicts with what we think about how to live. And actually, when Singer's article was first written, at least for the first 10 or 20 years, the way it was taught in class, the way I think it was probably taught to me, is as an example of something that seems to be a sound argument, but leads to a conclusion that obviously can't be right. And it was taught as a kind of puzzle. And so students were set the puzzle, now figure out where it goes wrong. Because clearly this is a counterintuitive result. It couldn't be right. Well, I think Socrates gives us reason to think this isn't really a sufficient answer either. What Socrates did when he turned people around and gave them vertigo was he would ask them about how they were living, and he would tend to show them that their intuitions about how to live were actually in conflict. He wouldn't come from outside and bring some claim and force it on them. He would get them to realize that their own beliefs about how to live didn't cohere. And I think that's what Singer's doing here. That's why his arguments are so simple. The intuitions about the shallow pond case, the intuitions about moral equality, conflict with intuitions about what we think is an acceptable way of life. And I don't think he's forcing on us some externally motivated philosophical superstructure. I think he's showing us that our intuitions about what's right themselves conflict. And so the fact that it's counterintuitive in and of itself I don't think is an objection. Furthermore, there's a long history of things being counterintuitive that we now think were right. That's a representation of ancient Greek slavery. You don't have to go all the way back to the ancient Greeks to find people who thought it was just intuitive. It just seems obvious that some people were born to be slaves and others were born to be masters. It just seems obvious that there are differences between the sexes that mean some people should work and other people shouldn't work, and so forth. Intuitions have a very bad history of getting it morally right. Or at least we tend to think there can be progress beyond intuitions, and maybe this is an example of progress. But I think people who oppose Singer will push on the counterintuition point a little bit more, and they'll say, no, you don't get it. It's really, really counterintuitive. It actually conflicts with really, really basic ideas. And the people who make this argument tend to say, what Singer's argument leads to is the idea you should do whatever it is creates the most good in the world. But that actually leads in some really unsettling directions. It might lead to Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment, who thought that by killing an old lady and giving her money away, he would do the most good. And geez, if Singer is telling us we should be like Raskolnikov, it seems something has gone askew here. Or there's a famous trolley case where the trolley is coming down the track and it's going to run over these 5 people. Should you push the guy onto the train tracks? Singer's argument seems to say yes, obviously, but a lot of people have questions with that. And maybe I shouldn't put this up in the TMC. This is a philosophical case that I always like to bring up because I really like the name of the case. It's called the Inhospitable hospital case. And it's a thought experiment in which this physician can kill 5 people, and he can take their organs and he can give them to 5 people who otherwise would die, and it seems like he can perform the most good. But we think there's got to be something wrong with that. That can't be right. So an argument is Singer seems to lead in this direction. Now, I think Singer has responses to that. First of all, I think he could draw distinctions between these cases. I think he could say there's a difference between doing something that involves killing another person, that is sacrificing something morally important. There's a difference between harming to help and just helping to help. Or sometimes people who agree with Singer will bite the bullet and say, well, if you really were in these situations, maybe it's what you ought to do, but you're not in those situations. Anyway, that's another argument. Here's an additional objection to Singer's view. The idea that there are other goods besides altruism. The idea that moral goods aren't the only goods. And the woman who developed this is a woman named Susan Wolf, a philosopher. And what she maintains is moral goods aren't the only goods. And when we're trying to figure out how to live, when we're trying to figure out what sort of people we want around us, when we're trying to figure out what sort of people we want our children to be, we think about things other than simply moral goods. And she gives a bunch of examples that she thinks, and I don't know if she's right about this, but it's an interesting idea. She thinks if you're concerned exclusively with morality and doing the most good, you're not going to be able to have a really, really sharp, caustic wit. And yet, that's a good thing. That's something we want in people. That's something we hope we have. That's something we hope our friends have and our family, our children have. And she gives another few examples, and you can tell her age by her examples. Katharine Hepburn's grace, Paul Newman's cool, Picasso's artistic talent. She thinks these are things that we value. They might not be moral goods, but they're goods. And it's hard to have these things if, in fact, all you care about is morality. She also gives the example of the drive to solve an outstanding problem in algebra. She thinks that's a great thing when someone has that kind of drive, that curiosity. But it might not do any good for anybody. And yet, this isn't the sort of thing we would want to lose, but if you take Singer's conclusion, if you live the way people are living like in Strangers Drowning, you're going to be left out of these things. And she writes, when one reflects on the loving saint, easily and gladly, giving up his fishing trip or his stereo or his hot fudge sundae at the drop of a moral hat, one is apt to wonder not at how much he loves morality, but how little he loves those other things. One thinks that if he can give those up so easily, he does not know what it is to truly love them. There seems to be a kind of joy which the loving saint is incapable of experiencing. And frankly, when I read this book, Strangers Drowning, I had this reaction to these people. I understood why they were doing what they were doing, and I understood the arguments. I did not like these people. I did not think I would want to spend any time with these people, and I wasn't sure that I would want my kids to turn into those people. At the same time, this is because Woolf thinks morality isn't all there is to life, and that there seems to be a limit to how much morality we can stand. And she says, a person may be perfectly wonderful without being perfectly moral. I don't think Singer finds this argument very convincing, but it might capture what a lot of people feel goes off the rails about him. There are other kinds of goods that maybe are moral goods that maybe you lose if you take Singer's argument. And this has been a popular view, or at least a lot of people have said it, and David Brooks made this argument in an op-ed he wrote specifically about Jason Trigg, specifically about the effective altruism movement. And David Brooks said, you know, Jason Trigg giving up his life to this, I admire it in a way, but I think he's making a mistake. Why? I would be wary, Brooks says, of inverting the natural order of affections. Not many people value abstract life perceived as a statistic as much as the actual child being fed, hugged, nurtured, and played with. So his concern is that Jason Trigg is going to lose something about compassion for those close to him if he's so concerned with people far away. And he goes on to say, you might become one of those people who loves humanity in general, but not the particular humans immediately around you. You might end up enlarging the faculties we use to perceive the far, rationality, and eclipsing the faculties we use to interact with those closest around, affection, the capacity for vulnerable and dependence. And this is an argument that isn't new. It's a claim that isn't new. Dickens, in Hard Times and Bleak House, I think makes the same argument against the philosophical position utilitarianism, which is where Singer is really coming from. I don't know how well you know those two books, but he has characters. In Hard Times, it's Gradgrind. In Bleak House, it's a woman named Mrs. Jellyby. And Mrs. Jellyby practices what she calls telescopic philanthropy. So she has many children, but she spends all her time and efforts helping a tribe in Africa. And her children are greatly neglected. And her children don't get any love. And they don't even get washed. Meanwhile, she's always got these telescopic views. She's always thinking about the Africans when she's ignoring the plight of her own children. And I think that's the concern that Brooks has. Now, Dickens is not one for subtlety, right? Dickens paints his characters pretty broadly, and he makes it easy because what he does is he makes Mrs. Jellyby just kind of despicable, and he makes her into someone that actually doesn't do any good anyway for the Africans and destroys the lives of her children. But we might wonder this. It's a story you can tell. Brooks says it. It's not a crazy thing to say. But we might wonder whether following Singer's conclusions will really change you in this way. Will it really make you like that? I'm not sure. The people in Strangers Drowning, I kind of think they were already that way. And I'm not sure that they were, I'm not sure. This is a psychological question that I don't have an answer to. I think Singer would ask, would a person's becoming that way actually clearly be a bad thing? Now it is if you're Mrs. Jellyby and you're not actually doing any good for anybody. But what if you're saving hundreds of lives, like Trigg? It's at least a question. So this is an argument against Singer's view, but I'm not sure where we end up. But it's something to think about. Let me close by talking about another approach to really try to get at some of the points that Woolf and David Brooks were raising, but maybe in a somewhat different way, by drawing a distinction between moral pluralism and moral monism. And this is something I do in the book, but don't get your hopes up. The book is not full of interesting stories. It's very, well, there are some stories, but it's a philosophy book. But I do talk about this sort of thing. How does this work? Well, here are a bunch of things that most of us think are morally important. Concern for humanity as a whole, concern for family, self-concern, friendship, respect for rights of individuals, and then beauty and truth. I put those in parentheses because maybe those aren't moral goods, but gosh, we think they're goods. Okay, now moral monism is the idea that there's only one fundamental moral value, and that all the other values are derivative on that value. Why might you hold moral pluralism? I mean, moral monism. You might hold that because you think, you know, these are going to come into conflict. And they do come into conflict. And we have to have some way of figuring out what to do. And the way we figure it out is we look to see what's most fundamental. And when they conflict, we go with most fundamental, whereas the derivative one matters only because of how it serves that. Now, if I'm a moral monist, and I think, I've got to pick one of those things to be my overriding value. I can only pick one, and the others are going to be valuable only to the extent that they promote that one. If I'm going to do that, I might end up picking the first. I might think, if I have to pick one as most important, maybe that's what I would pick. And if you pick that as being the fundamental value, and you're a moral monist, I think all of Singer's conclusions come crashing in on you. What's the alternative? The alternative is to be what I call a moral pluralist. Now, a moral pluralist holds there are multiple fundamental values. That concern for family isn't just a little bit of concern for humanity. Friendship isn't a little bit of concern for humanity. Rights aren't just all those things matter intrinsically. They sit at the bottom of our justification of how to live. They're not all in one hierarchy. And there's no single rule for resolving conflict. So in this view, concern for humanity as a whole certainly matters. But friendship and self-concern for that matter too, not because they just happen to promote that. Those two are fundamental values. And while sometimes concern for humanity might override those other values, sometimes friendship or concern for family or even self-concern might override the other. If you're a pluralist, you can hold that sort of thing. Question, why should you be a pluralist? Well, again, I could say, well, I like that better because it gives me a reason to act this way. That's not a satisfactory way of justifying this. We can't simply say this is a possibility and geez, it gets us the conclusion we like, so it must be true. What we need is we have to have some independent reason for thinking that moral pluralism is true. And I think there might be an independent reason for thinking moral pluralism is true, having to do with our psychologies. A lot to say there. As I said, I wrote a book on it. But I'm not sure if it works, but you need some independent reason. An upshot is that compassion might not be a single thing, or altruism might not be a single thing. We might need a more fine-grained moral conceptual framework where we realize, there are different things that kind of look alike and kind of have similarities, but they actually can conflict and they don't all build in one direction. I don't know whether it all works. Socrates didn't give answers. What Socrates always said is the unexamined life is not worth living, and what he said he was doing was just trying to get people to think about their lives, not to tell them what they should do. Certainly, Singer did that for me, and hopefully for you too. Thanks.
Thank you.